There are moments that don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with noise, with certainty, or with the dramatic weight people imagine life-changing realizations should carry. They arrive quietly, almost invisibly, blending into ordinary conversations and familiar silence, until one day you realize they have been changing everything without ever asking for permission. That's where I am now. Not standing at the beginning of something, not standing at the end, standing in the exact place where pretending not to notice has become more exhausting than accepting what has already happened. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that eventually whatever this was would settle into something ordinary. That familiarity would replace the strange precision I kept feeling every time our thoughts crossed paths. People become predictable. That's how relationships usually work. The unknown slowly becomes routine. The extraordinary fades into something manageable. I expected the same thing here. Instead, the opposite happened. The more time passed, the less ordinary this became. Every conversation removed another layer I didn't know I was protecting. Every silence carried more meaning than entire discussions I've had with other people. Every pause somehow communicated something words would have interrupted instead of explaining. That shouldn't happen. Not this quickly. Not this naturally. Not with someone who entered my life without years of history behind them. Because understanding usually has a timeline, recognition has a process, trust has milestones. This ignored every single one of them. I keep replaying the first moments in my mind, searching for the point where everything shifted. The strange thing is, I can't find one. There wasn't a single sentence that changed everything. No defining conversation, no confession, no dramatic event. It happened gradually enough to escape notice, yet completely enough that now I can't imagine my mind functioning the way it did before. That's what unsettles me, not the connection itself. The fact that I never watched it happen, it simply became true. Like sunrise, you never see darkness turning into light. You only notice that night is gone. That's what this feels like. Somewhere between one conversation and the next, something fundamental rearranged itself. I have spent years becoming someone who understands distance, not emotional distance, structural distance, the kind that allows you to care without becoming dependent, to understand without becoming exposed, to remain present without giving away the parts of yourself that cannot survive careless interpretation. It worked for a long time. It worked perfectly. People knew versions of me, different angles, different reflections. Nobody held the complete picture. Not because they weren't capable, because I never believed complete visibility was necessary. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe most connections don't require it. Maybe most people are satisfied existing beside each other instead of within each other's awareness. I thought I was one of those people, until you made that assumption impossible to maintain. You never demanded access. That's the part I keep returning to. You never asked me to explain myself. You never insisted on honesty, as if honesty were something owed. You never pushed against my boundaries hoping persistence would eventually be rewarded. You simply remained exactly where you were. Calm, present, attentive, without expectation. And somehow that accomplished what force never could, because defenses are designed to resist pressure. They're not designed to resist patience. They're not designed to resist someone who doesn't seem interested in winning. They're certainly not designed to resist someone who appears completely comfortable with uncertainty. Most people panic around silence. They rush toward conclusions because unanswered questions make them uncomfortable. They interpret, assume, complete unfinished thoughts with pieces borrowed from their own experiences. You didn't. You left space exactly where space belonged. You allowed unfinished thoughts to remain unfinished. You trusted that meaning would arrive when it was ready, instead of dragging it into existence before it understood itself. Do you know how rare that is? To meet someone who doesn't need immediate certainty, someone who can sit beside complexity without trying to simplify it, someone who understands that clarity isn't always immediate. I didn't realize how accustomed I had become to explaining myself until I met someone who required almost no explanation. That changed something inside me, because explanation creates distance. The moment you begin translating yourself, you separate your experience from the person receiving it. You become an interpreter instead of simply existing. Around you, I noticed myself translating less, not because I stopped caring whether you understood, because I realized you already did, not perfectly, not magically, just accurately enough, that unnecessary explanations started disappearing on their own. That's different. There's comfort, and then there's recognition. Comfort makes you feel safe. Recognition makes you feel seen. Those aren't the same experience. Safety is external. Recognition reaches somewhere much deeper. It touches identity. It quietly asks whether you've been carrying parts of yourself alone that were never meant to remain unseen forever. I don't know when I started measuring my thoughts against yours, not comparing, not seeking approval, simply wondering how you would interpret something before I had even finished understanding it myself. That's never happened before. I've respected people, admired people, learned from people, but integrating someone into the architecture of my own thinking, that's unfamiliar territory. It's difficult to describe because it isn't emotional in the obvious sense. It isn't obsession. It isn't dependence. It isn't constant excitement. It's quieter than all of those, steadier, like discovering a second perspective that somehow exists inside your own without replacing it. You don't become less yourself. You become more aware of yourself through another presence. That's the closest language comes to describing it. Even then, language feels insufficient because language separates. Experience doesn't. The truth exists before the words arrive. Sometimes I think what unsettles me most isn't how deeply you've entered my awareness, it's how naturally it happened. Nothing about this felt forced. Nothing required convincing. I wasn't persuaded. I wasn't overwhelmed. There wasn't a battle between logic and emotion where one finally defeated the other. Everything remained strangely calm, as though two patterns recognized each other and quietly aligned without needing permission from either of us. People often describe connection as chemistry. I don't think that's accurate. Chemistry can be unpredictable, explosive, temporary. This feels more like mathematics, precise, balanced, quietly inevitable, not because destiny demands it, because certain structures simply fit together, not perfectly, accurately. Tsukurisi matters more than perfection ever could. Perfection is performance. Tsukurisi is reality. Reality doesn't need decoration. It simply exists. That's what keeps pulling my attention back. Nothing here asks to be exaggerated. Nothing needs dramatic language to justify itself. If anything, the quieter it becomes, the more undeniable it feels. There's something strange about being understood before you've fully understood yourself. At first, it feels impossible, then uncomfortable. Eventually, it becomes strangely reassuring. Not because someone has answers you don't, because they notice questions you haven't finished asking. That's what you've done repeatedly. You've responded to thoughts that were still forming, not by finishing them, by making space for them to continue. That distinction matters. Finishing someone else's thought is interruption. Making space for it is companionship, real companionship, the kind that exists beneath conversation. I used to believe independence meant needing no one. Now I'm beginning to wonder whether true independence also includes recognizing the rare people who don't diminish it. Maybe strength isn't refusing influence. Maybe strength is recognizing healthy influence without confusing it for weakness, because influence isn't always invasion. Sometimes it's expansion. Sometimes another person doesn't replace your perspective, they increase its resolution. Everything remains yours. You simply see more clearly. That's what frightens me. Not losing myself. Finding parts of myself I couldn't access alone, because once you've discovered they're there, you're responsible for them. You can't unknow yourself. You can't return to smaller awareness once larger awareness has become available. Every meaningful realization carries responsibility. This one is no different. I've tried imagining what happens if I leave all of this unspoken, if I simply continue pretending everything remains unchanged. Externally, maybe nothing would happen. Conversations would continue. Life would continue. The world rarely notices internal revolutions, but I would notice every day, because silence doesn't erase truth, it only delays its consequences. Eventually reality catches up. It always does. That's why I find myself here now, not because I enjoy vulnerability, because honesty has become simpler than avoidance. Avoidance requires constant maintenance. Truth simply exists. Maybe that's the lesson hidden inside all of this. The things that truly belong in our lives don't demand constant effort to remain real. They remain real whether we acknowledge them or not. Acknowledgement changes us, not reality. Reality was already waiting. I've wondered whether you've noticed any of this, whether your experience resembles mine, whether you've felt these quiet shifts happening beneath ordinary conversations. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. Oddly enough, the answer matters less than I expected, because this realization no longer depends on reciprocity. It's become part of my understanding regardless. That's important. I don't need certainty about your internal world before becoming honest about mine. Those are separate responsibilities. I can only answer for what exists within me. And within me, something has undeniably changed. The way I evaluate ideas, the way I experience silence, the way I recognize sincerity, the way I understand closeness. Nothing collapsed. Nothing broke. Everything simply rearranged itself into a clearer pattern. That's why I can't describe this as disruption. Disruption creates disorder. This created coherence, unexpected coherence, the kind that makes previous confusion suddenly understandable, as though pieces that always belonged together finally occupied the same space. It's difficult explaining coherence to people who expect excitement. This isn't exciting, it's grounding, like standing on stable ground after spending years adapting to uneven terrain without realizing it. You don't celebrate stability, you relax into it. Only afterward do you realize how much energy uncertainty had been consuming. That's another change you've brought into my awareness. I think less about protecting every part of myself. Not because protection became unnecessary, because discernment replaced it. There's a difference. Protection assumes danger. Discernment recognizes reality. One closes every door. The other simply opens the right ones. Perhaps that's what you've quietly taught me. Not through advice, through presence. Presence teaches differently than instruction. Instruction tells you what to believe. Presence demonstrates what already exists. I've always trusted demonstration more than explanation. Maybe that's why this reached me, not because it was persuasive, because it was consistent. Consistency reveals character more accurately than intensity ever could. Anyone can create intensity. Very few people maintain quiet consistency. That's where trust begins. Not in promises, in patterns. Reliable patterns, Bartals that remain unchanged, whether circumstances are convenient or difficult. You became one of those patterns before I consciously recognized it. Now I notice it everywhere. In how I approach conversations, in how carefully I choose honesty over performance, in how often I stop pretending certainty where uncertainty deserves respect. You've changed my standards, not for other people, For myself, that's the deepest impact anyone can have, changing how someone understands themselves. Not through pressure, through reflection. I don't think mirrors create faces. They simply reveal them. Maybe that's all you've ever been. Not someone who transformed me. Someone who reflected what was already becoming true. That feels more accurate, more respectful to reality. Because no one builds another person's identity. They can only illuminate parts already waiting to be seen. You illuminated something I had overlooked, the capacity to remain completely myself while allowing another person genuine proximity. I honestly didn't know those things could coexist. I assumed closeness required compromise, that visibility required sacrificing complexity. You quietly disproved both assumptions, without trying. That's still the part I admire most. Nothing about this seems intentional in the manipulative sense. No strategy, no careful positioning, no attempt to become important. Impermanence happened naturally, because authenticity remained consistent. Perhaps that's why it carries so much weight. Nothing manufactured lasts. Only genuine things survive sustained attention, and I've been paying attention, closer attention than I intended, closer attention than I usually allow. Every observation leads back to the same conclusion. You haven't asked me to become someone else, you've somehow made becoming more myself feel possible. Do you understand how unusual that is? Most relationships negotiate identity. This one clarified it. That's why walking away wouldn't restore my previous life. It would only remove the mirror while leaving the reflection permanently remembered. Some understandings can't be forgotten, only accepted. I'm beginning to accept this one, slowly, carefully, without rushing toward conclusions, without forcing definitions before they're ready, not because I'm uncertain, because I respect what this has become too much to reduce it into convenient language. Some realities deserve patience, not because they're fragile, because they're significant. Significance shouldn't be hurried. I don't know exactly where all of this leads. For once, that uncertainty doesn't frighten me, not because outcomes stopped mattering, because the truth already exists, regardless of outcome. Sometimes recognizing reality is the most important decision. Everything else comes afterward. So if one day I finally say all of this aloud, without hesitation, if one day these thoughts become spoken words instead of quiet understanding, it won't be because something new appeared. It will be because I finally stopped resisting what had already become undeniable. You'll think the moment changed everything. It won't have. The change happened long before either of us noticed. The words will simply arrive late, late enough to honor the silence that carried them, late enough to respect the truth that never demanded urgency, late enough to understand that some connections aren't built through dramatic moments. They're built through countless ordinary ones that quietly reshape two lives until one day both people realize they are no longer standing where they began. And maybe that's the most honest thing I can say. You didn't interrupt my life. You didn't overturn it. You didn't ask me to become someone different. You simply entered my awareness so completely that my understanding of myself expanded to make room for a reality I never expected to experience. That reality doesn't need exaggeration. It doesn't need promises. It doesn't even need immediate answers. It only asks for honesty. And after everything I've tried to analyze, question, contain, and understand, honesty leaves me with only one conclusion. Some people arrive loudly and disappear just as quickly. Others arrive so quietly that you don't recognize their significance until they've already become part of the foundation beneath your thoughts. You became the second kind, not through effort, not through insistence, not through timing, through presence, steady enough to become familiar, accurate enough to become trusted, real enough to become impossible to ignore. I don't know what name the future will eventually give to all of this. Maybe it won't need one. Maybe some things are strongest before language narrows them into definitions. For now, I only know this. Before you, I believed understanding ended where another person's perspective began. After you, I discovered that sometimes true understanding expands because another perspective exists beside your own without trying to replace it. That discovery has already changed me. Not temporarily, not emotionally, structurally, and structures don't disappear because we stop looking at them. They continue holding everything built upon them. So whether this becomes a conversation, a decision, a journey, or simply a truth we quietly carry, one fact remains untouched. The version of me that existed before recognizing all of this no longer exists. Not because I lost anything, because I found something I never realized had been missing, a clearer way of seeing, a quieter way of trusting, a deeper way of understanding. And somewhere inside that understanding, without force, without demand, without either of us noticing the exact moment it happened, you became part of the way I now understand the world. That is the one truth I can no longer place back into silence. Because once awareness becomes this complete, it stops asking whether it is real. It begins asking whether you have the courage to live honestly with what you already know. I think I'm finally ready to answer that question.